Did medieval queens truly risk everything for a forbidden love? Could a secret affair ignite the flames of civil war, plunging an entire kingdom into chaos? What happened when illicit passion met the brutal realities of power and justice in the royal courts from the 12th to the 15th centuries? Number 6. The accusation and the ordeal of Maria of Brabbon. The year was 1276. In the grand, often chilly halls of the French court, a new kind of drama unfolded far from the battlefields. Philippe IV, a young king barely 8 years old, had just lost his mother. His father, Philippe III, the current king, had remarried just a few years earlier, taking Maria of Brabant as his queen. She was a beautiful woman, only in her early 20s, vibrant and full of life, a stark contrast to the somber court, often ruled by the stern gaze of her stepson. Young Philippe, known even then for his cold demeanor and sharp mind, was fiercely devoted to the memory of his mother. He looked upon his stepmother Marie with suspicion, perhaps even resentment. A particular figure at court caught Philippe's disapproving eye: Pierre de la Brosse, a man of humble birth who had risen swiftly through the ranks to become the king's chamberlain, a position of immense trust and influence. De la Brosse was cunning, ambitious, and had earned the king's ear. This closeness to the king, however, also bred enemies among the jealous nobility, who saw him as an upstart. Whispers began to circulate, subtle at first, then growing louder, like the rustle of autumn leaves before a storm. These rumors spoke of an unthinkable betrayal within the sacred walls of the royal palace. Queen Marie of Brabant, it was claimed, was engaged in an illicit affair with Pierre de la Brosse. The very notion was scandalous. Queen, the wife of the king, compromising her honor and the purity of the royal line with a commoner, no matter how powerful. It was a poison to the entire court, a stain on the crown itself. The young Prince Philippe, fueled by his dislike for both Marie and de la Brosse, reportedly took these whispers to his father, the king, presented the accusations with conviction, perhaps believing them fully, perhaps simply seeing an opportunity to discredit those he resented. King Philippe III was a man of simpler faith, easily swayed by omens and accusations. He was also a widower, already grappling with grief and the complexities of his second marriage. Faced with such a grave charge, especially one involving his beloved chamberlain and his young queen, the king was deeply troubled. The tension in the court became almost unbearable. Every glance seemed to hold a judgment, every conversation a hidden meaning. Queen Marie found herself isolated, her reputation under siege. Pierre de la Brosse, too, despite his influence, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had risen high, but a fall from such a height promised to be devastating. King, desperate for truth and perhaps lacking the strength to make a definitive judgment himself, turned to a medieval solution: the trial by combat. This was not a trial of witnesses or evidence in the modern sense. Instead, it was a test of God's judgment, where the outcome of a physical duel between champions would determine guilt or innocence. It was a terrifying prospect, a leap of faith into the brutal arena of combat. For the accusation against the queen, a champion was chosen to fight on her behalf to prove her innocence. This champion was an obscure nobleman named Robert of Artois. His opponent was a champion chosen by the accusers, a man named Thomas of St. Valery, who was allied with the faction supporting young Philippe. The stakes could not have been higher. If Robert of Artois lost, it would be seen as God's verdict that Queen Marie was indeed guilty of adultery, a crime punishable by severe disfigurement, public humiliation, or even death. If Thomas of St. Valery lost, the accusation would be declared false, and the accusers would face severe consequences. The day of the combat arrived, a spectacle both terrifying and enthralling. Knights, ladies, and common folk gathered eager to witness the divine judgment. The champions, clad in armor, faced each other in the lists. Clash of steel, the grunts of exertion, the roars of the crowd all filled the air. It was a fierce struggle, a brutal dance of swords and shields, each blow carrying the weight of a queen's honor and a chamberlain's life. In the end, Robert of Artois emerged victorious. Thomas of St. Valery fell defeated. The victory was a clear sign, at least in the eyes of the medieval world, that Queen Marie of Brabant was innocent. God, it was believed, had spoken. The accusation of adultery was false. The repercussions were swift and devastating for Pierre de la Brosse. Despite Queen Marie's vindication, the very fact that such a damaging rumor had reached the king's ears and been taken seriously was enough to seal de la Brosse's fate. His enemies, who had long resented his power and influence, seized the opportunity. Though the queen was declared innocent of adultery, de la Brosse was accused of treason, specifically of poisoning the king's eldest son from his first marriage, Louis, who had died earlier that year. This new accusation, likely manufactured or exaggerated by his rivals, stuck. On June 30th, 1278, Pierre de la Brosse, the once powerful chamberlain, was hanged from the gibbet at Montfaucon, a public execution site in Paris. His swift rise had been matched by an equally swift and brutal fall. The young King Philippe, who had been instrumental in bringing the original accusations against the Queen and de la Brosse to his father, watched as his stepmother's honor was restored and his hated rival was eliminated. Queen Marie, though cleared, carried the stain of the public accusation for the rest of her life, a stark reminder of the dangerous intrigues that simmered beneath the surface of the royal court. The incident left a lasting impression, revealing the fragility of reputation and the immense power of rumor in medieval France. Number 5. The Lady of Beauty and the King of France. In the mid-15th century, during a time when France was battered and broken by the 100 Years' War, a new kind of power emerged within the royal court, one rooted not in ancient lineage or military might, but in beauty, wit, and intimate influence. This was the story of Agnès Sorel, a woman who would become the most famous and influential mistress in French history, shaping policy, sparking scandal, and embodying a new era of royal indulgence. Charles VII, the King of France, was a weary figure. He had inherited a kingdom torn apart, ridiculed as the King of Bourgs, because so little of France remained under his control. His wife, Marie of Anjou, was a dutiful but unassuming queen who had borne him many children. King himself was known for his indecisiveness, his melancholy, and his string of minor mistresses. Then, around 1443, everything changed with the arrival of Agnès Sorel. Agnès was in her early 20s, a lady in waiting to Queen Marie. She was not just beautiful, she was stunning. Contemporary chroniclers and poets described her as having an ethereal quality, with large, expressive eyes, a delicate complexion, and a graceful figure. She was also intelligent, charming, and possessed a lively spirit that stood in stark contrast to the somber French court. Charles VII, usually reserved, was utterly captivated. Their affair began discreetly at first, but soon it became an open secret. Agnès moved from being merely a royal favorite to holding a unique and prominent position at court, far beyond that of any previous royal mistress. Charles showered her with unprecedented wealth and titles. She was granted the Château de l'Arche and the Seigneurie de Fromenteau, making her a lady in her own right. She dressed in lavish gowns adorned with jewels, and reportedly introduced new, more revealing fashions to the court, some of which shocked the more conservative sensibilities of the era. She even had her portrait painted, an unusual honor for a mistress, one that depicted her with one bare breast, a daring artistic choice for the time, a symbol of her bold, unconfession. Agnes's influence over the king was not limited to personal matters. She became deeply involved in court politics. It was whispered that she urged Charles to be more active, more determined in his efforts to reclaim France from the English. Some credited her with invigorating the king, inspiring him to finally push back against his enemies and restore his kingdom. She was a muse, a confidant, and a political advisor all in one. High-ranking nobles seeking the king's favor knew they often had to go through Agnès. She held audiences, offered opinions, and her recommendations carried significant weight. This unprecedented power, however, bred resentment. While some saw her as a positive force, others viewed her as a scandalous interloper, a corrupting influence on the king, and a threat to the queen's rightful position. The Dauphin, the future Louis XI, openly despised her. He saw her as a rival for his father's affections and a symbol of his father's perceived weaknesses. Their animosity was so strong that at one point, Louis physically drove Agnès out of the king's presence, an act of rebellion that deeply angered Charles VII. Despite the criticisms, Agnès bore Charles 4 daughters, all of whom were publicly acknowledged by the king and given royal treatment, even though they were illegitimate. This was another break from tradition, a clear sign of the king's devotion and Agnes's undeniable status. In February 1450, while pregnant with her 5th child, Agnès Sorel joined Charles VII on campaign in Jumièges, Normandy, a region newly recaptured from the English. She fell ill suddenly and died shortly after giving birth to a stillborn child. She was only 28 years old. Her death immediately sparked rumors. Such a sudden demise for a young, vibrant woman in such a prominent, controversial position inevitably led to suspicions of foul play. Many whispered of poison. Prime suspect for many was the Dauphin Louis, given his deep-seated hatred for her. Others pointed fingers at Jacques Coeur, the king's wealthy financier, and a close ally of Agnès, who was later arrested and accused of various crimes, including poisoning, though this charge was never proven. Centuries later, in 2005, forensic scientists exhumed Agnès Sorel's remains from her tomb in the Collège de Saint-Ours in Los. Their examination revealed a high concentration of mercury in her hair and bones. While mercury was sometimes used in medieval remedies, the levels found were exceptionally high, consistent with acute mercury poisoning. This finding seemed to confirm the centuries-old suspicions of poisoning. However, whether it was deliberate murder or an accidental overdose from a misguided medieval medical treatment remains a subject of debate among historians. Agnès Sorel's story is a fascinating glimpse into the complex world of medieval power, where personal relationships could intertwine with national destiny. She defied convention, challenged norms, and left an undeniable mark on the French court, forever known as the Lady of Beauty, whose allure and influence changed the course of a king's reign. Number 4. The Mad King, his Queen, and the Duke of Orleans. As the 14th century drew to a close and the 15th began, France was a nation in disarray, caught in the throes of the 100 Years' War. At the heart of this crumbling kingdom sat a king, Charles VI, who was increasingly losing his grip on reality, his mind frequently plunging into fits of terrifying madness. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, a woman of strong will and often scandalous reputation, found herself thrust into a treacherous political landscape where whispered accusations of adultery and Rouspierstrophe. Isabeau had arrived in France as a young German princess chosen to marry the vibrant and seemingly stable Charles VI. For a time, their marriage was fruitful, producing many children, and the king was known as Charles the Beloved. But then, in 1392, something fundamental broke. Charles suffered his first severe attack of madness, believing himself to be St. George and attacking his own knights. These episodes became more frequent and more prolonged. He would forget his identity, refuse to bathe, believe his wife and children were strangers, and at times become violently unpredictable. With the king incapacitated for long periods, a power vacuum opened, threatening to tear France apart. A regency council was formed, but it was fraught with bitter rivalries. Queen Isabeau, as mother of the heir, naturally played a central role, but her authority was constantly challenged. Two powerful dukes emerged as the main contenders for influence: Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, the king's uncle, and Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother. Louis of Orleans was a maniac, ambitious, and notoriously pleasure-loving man. He was everything his older brother, the king, was not. Healthy, clever, and interested in courtly pursuits and lavish entertainments. He was also, crucially, very close to Queen Isabeau. Their bond became a subject of intense gossip and suspicion across Europe. Chroniclers from the period, particularly those sympathetic to the Burgundian faction, openly accused Queen Isabeau and Louis of Orleans of having an adulterous affair. They pointed to their shared love of luxury, their frequent private meetings, and the Duke's growing influence over the Queen during the king's periods of lucidity and madness alike. The rumors suggested that Louis was not only the Queen's lover but also the father of some of her younger children, an accusation that, if true, would have thrown the legitimacy of the royal line into question and created an unprecedented scandal. While historical evidence to definitively prove the affair remains elusive, the perception of it was very real and had profound political consequences. The Burgundians, led by Philip the Bold, and later his son John the Fearless, skillfully used the rumors to discredit Louis of Orleans and undermine Queen Isabeau's authority. They painted Louis as a debauched womanizer, and the Queen as a corrupt foreign influence on the throne, neglecting her duties for illicit pleasures. The rivalry between Louis of Orleans and the Duke of Burgundy escalated into open hostility, mirroring the larger conflict in France. They vied for control of the king's person, for influence over royal policy, and for access to the royal treasury. Louis' lavish lifestyle and his attempts to control the finances were particularly resented by the common people, who were suffering under heavy taxes during the war. The political tensions reached a boiling point in November 1407, a decade and a half after the king's madness began. Louis of Orleans was returning home one evening after visiting Queen Isabeau. He was ambushed in the streets of Paris by a group of masked assassins. Struck down by axes and swords, the Duke of Orleans died instantly. His body left in the street, the murder sent shockwaves through France. It quickly became clear that the assassination had been orchestrated by John the Fearless, the new Duke of Burgundy, who openly confessed to the act, claiming he had removed a tyrant and traitor who had been poisoning the kingdom. The assassination of Louis of Orleans marked a turning point, plunging France into a brutal civil war between the Armagnac faction, supporters of the Orleans family, and the Burgundians. Queen Isabeau, whatever her personal relationship with Louis, was devastated by his death. She spent the rest of her life navigating the treacherous waters of the Armagnac-Burgundian conflict, on the ongoing war with England, often making unpopular alliances that further eroded her reputation. The whispers of her affair with Louis of Orleans continued to haunt her, defining her image for centuries as a queen who put personal desires before the stability of her kingdom. Her story is a chilling reminder of how personal intrigue, fueled by political ambition, could lead to violence and tear a nation apart in the medieval world. Number 3. The Duke, the Governess, and the Royal Bloodline. The 14th century in England was a time of epic struggles, power shifts, and the long, grinding conflict of the 100 Years' War. At the heart of this tumultuous period stood John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, a son of King Edward III, and arguably the most powerful nobleman in England. He was a seasoned military commander, a shrewd politician, and a man whose private life would send ripples through the very fabric of the English royal line for centuries to come. His story is one of enduring love, social scandal, and an affair that openly defied convention. John of Gaunt was no ordinary duke. He held vast lands, immense wealth, and commanded significant political influence. He married twice. First to Blanche of Lancaster, a woman he deeply loved and who bore him many children, including the future Henry IV. After Blanche's death, he married Constanza of Castile, a claim to the Castilian throne that further fueled his ambitions and England's involvement in continental wars. Yet, It was a relationship outside of these dynastic marriages that would leave the most profound legacy. Around 1371, while still married to Constanza, John of Gaunt began an affair with Catherine Swynford. Catherine was a woman of good birth, but not high nobility. She was the daughter of a Hainaut knight and had been married to a modest knight in Gaunt's service, Sir Hugh Swynford. Crucially, Catherine had also served as the governess to Gaunt's daughters, Philippa and Elizabeth, from his marriage to Blanche. This meant she was a familiar presence in the ducal household, someone close to the heart of the family, making the eventual affair even more potent a scandal. Their relationship was not a fleeting dalliance. It blossomed into a long-term, passionate affair that would last for more than 2 decades. Catherine bore John of Gaunt 4 children, all of whom were given the surname Beaufort, after a castle in Champagne, France, that Gaunt owned. These children were Henry, Thomas, John, and Joan. For years, they grew up in the Duke's household, acknowledged as his children, even as his wife. Constanza remained alive. The affair was a public spectacle, at least within court circles. While extramarital affairs were not uncommon among the nobility, the Duke of Lancaster was a prince of the blood, and his open relationship with Catherine Swynford, especially after the birth of their children, caused significant controversy. It was scandalous, not just for its existence, but for its duration and the Duke's evident devotion to Catherine. When Gaunt eventually left England to pursue his claim to the Castilian throne, Catherine remained in England, diligently managing his estates and caring for their children. Their separation was one of necessity, not estrangement. When Constanza of Castile died in 1394, John of Gaunt was finally free to act on his true feelings. Despite his advanced age, he was 54, and despite the social implications, he made the astonishing decision to marry Catherine Swynford in 1396. This was an almost unheard-of event for a royal duke. To marry one's long-term mistress, a woman who had given him illegitimate children, was a bold move that challenged the very foundations of aristocratic society and traditional notions of royal lineage. The marriage took place in Lincoln Cathedral, and the king, Richard II, Gaunt's nephew, even attended. The marriage itself was a statement, but the true impact came a year later. In 1397, John of Gaunt used his immense influence to secure a royal decree from King Richard II, legitimizing all 4 of his children with Catherine Swynford. This meant that the Beaufort children, once born out of wedlock, were now legally recognized as legitimate offspring of a royal duke. This was a crucial step. But there was one important caveat. While they could inherit property and titles, they were explicitly barred from inheriting the throne. The legitimization of the Beauforts, however, would still have profound consequences for English history. John of Gaunt died in 1399, just a few months before his son, Henry Bolingbroke, from his first marriage to Blanche, deposed King Richard II and seized the throne, becoming King Henry IV. This established the House of Lancaster on the English throne, a dynasty that had originated from Gaunt's line. The Beauforts, despite their initial exclusion from the throne, became a powerful and influential family in their own right, holding important positions in government and the church. And then over a century later, the Beaufort legacy would come full circle. Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of John and Catherine's son John Beaufort, married Edmund Tudor. Their son Henry Tudor would eventually seize the English throne in 1485, becoming King Henry VII and establishing the Tudor dynasty. This meant that the Tudor monarchs, including the famous Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, traced a significant part of their lineage directly back to the illegitimate children of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. The story of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford is a powerful testament to the complexities of love, power, and social norms in the medieval period. It is a tale of a passionate affair that transcended scandal, culminating in a surprising marriage and ultimately reshaping the very lineage of the English crown. Number 2. The scholar, the nun, and a vengeful uncle. In the early 12th century, Paris was rapidly becoming a center of intellectual life in Europe. Scholars flocked to its nascent universities, eager to engage in the debates and philosophical discussions that defined the era. Among the most brilliant and controversial of these figures was Peter Abelard, a logician and theologian whose sharp mind and eloquent lectures drew students from across the continent. His fame, however, would be tragically intertwined with a forbidden love that scandalized medieval society and left a lasting mark on history. Abelard was a rock star of his time. He challenged established dogma, questioned authority, and possessed an arrogance that matched his genius. His intellectual prowess, however, was accompanied by a passionate nature that would prove to be his undoing. Around 1115, Abelard, then in his late 30s, met Heloise, a young woman of extraordinary intelligence and beauty, living under the guardianship of her uncle Fulbert, a canon of Notre Dame. Heloise was barely 17, but she had already acquired a remarkable education, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, a rare achievement for a woman of her time. Her brilliance captivated Abelard, who became her tutor. What began as a master-student relationship soon transformed into a secret, intense love affair. Abelard, supposedly dedicated to a clerical life, and Heloise, destined for the church or an arranged marriage, were drawn together by an undeniable intellectual and emotional connection. They used their studies as a cover for their clandestine meetings, exchanging passionate letters and verses. Their relationship, however, was a dangerous game. Clerics were forbidden to marry or have sexual relations, and any illicit affair, especially one that resulted in pregnancy, would ruin Abelard's promising career. Despite the risks, their love deepened. Heloise became pregnant. To protect Abelard's reputation and career, they decided to keep the pregnancy a secret. Heloise was smuggled away to Abelard's sister's home in Brittany, where she gave birth to a son whom she named Estrella. After the birth, Abelard, perhaps feeling a sense of responsibility or genuinely wanting to legitimize their bond, proposed a secret marriage. Heloise remarkably resisted, arguing that a wife and family would destroy Abelard's philosophical career. She believed the scholar should be free from earthly ties, unburdened by domestic concerns. She saw the potential for a glorious future for him and was willing to sacrifice her own happiness for his intellectual pursuits. However, Abelard insisted, and they were secretly married in Paris, with only a few witnesses. This was another attempt to calm Fulbert's wrath and prevent any further scandal, though it was still a desperate measure. Fulbert, Heloise's uncle, was furious. He felt deeply dishonored by the affair, the pregnancy, and the secret marriage. He believed Abelard had seduced his niece and exploited her innocence. His rage festered, leading him to plan a brutal act of vengeance that would shock even a hardened medieval society. One night, while Abelard was asleep in his lodgings, a group of men hired by Fulbert broke in. They seized Abelard and in a horrific act of mutilation castrated him. The act was a cruel and symbolic punishment for his perceived sexual transgressions and a direct blow to his ability to continue a secular life, including his academic career. The brutal attack ended Abelard's career as a public lecturer in Paris. Deeply shamed and physically scarred, he retreated to the monastery of Saint Denis, becoming a monk. Heloise, at Abelard's insistence, also took the veil, becoming a nun at the convent of Argenteuil, and later rising to become the abbess of the Paraclete monastery. Their physical separation, however, did not sever their intellectual and emotional bond. For years they corresponded, their letters becoming some of the most famous and poignant examples of medieval literature. In these letters they reflected on their past, their love, their suffering, and their philosophical and theological ideas. Heloise in particular expressed her continued devotion to Abelard, her regret at their tragic fate, and her enduring love for him, often challenging medieval notions of sin and redemption. Abelard continued to write and teach in monastic settings, but his reputation was forever marked by the scandal. He faced accusations of heresy for some of his theological views, further compounding his misfortunes. He died in 1142. Heloise survived him by 20 years, dedicating her life to her monastic community and to the intellectual legacy they had shared. She arranged for Abelard to be buried at the Paraclete. The story of Heloise and Abelard is not just a tale of adultery and intrigue. It is a profound exploration of love, sacrifice, intellectual passion, and the unforgiving nature of medieval justice. Their tragedy resonated through the centuries, their letters providing a raw and honest glimpse into the lives of two extraordinary individuals, caught in a world that could not contain their intellect or their love. Number 1. The She-Wolf Queen and Her Lover. In the early 14th century, England was ruled by King Edward II, a monarch whose reign was defined by his disastrous military defeats, his unpopular favorites, and his disastrous neglect of his duties. His queen, Isabella of France, was a woman of exceptional beauty and intelligence, daughter of the powerful French king, Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. Their marriage, initially promising, would eventually shatter in a storm of political intrigue, personal betrayal, and a dramatic coup that saw a queen depose her own husband, all for the love of an edict nobleman. Edward II's reign began with great expectations, but quickly descended into chaos. He alienated his nobles by lavishing titles, wealth, and power on a succession of male favorites. First Piers Gaveston, and then, after Gaveston's execution, by the barons Hugh Despencer the Younger. Despencer and his father, Hugh Despencer the Elder, gained almost absolute control over the king, monopolizing royal power and lands, creating a deeply unpopular and oppressive regime. Queen Isabella, initially a loyal wife, found herself increasingly marginalized and humiliated. The Despensers actively sought to diminish her influence, even confiscating her lands and jewels. Edward II, blinded by his devotion to Despencer, often sided against his wife, further isolating her. Isabella, a proud and intelligent woman, was not one to suffer slights patiently. She watched as her husband's infatuation with the Despensers brought England to the brink of civil war and alienated her own position as queen in 1325. A rare opportunity arose. Isabella's brother, Charles IV of France, demanded Edward II pay homage for Gascony, a remaining English territory in France. Edward, fearing to leave Despencer, sent Isabella to negotiate. This journey to her native France proved to be her liberation. It was in Paris that Isabella encountered Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had been imprisoned by Edward II and the Despensers but had dramatically escaped the Tower of London and fled to France. Mortimer was a dashing, ambitious, and mythic man, a stark contrast to her aloof and ineffective husband. Isabella and Mortimer found common ground in their shared hatred of the Despensers and their desire to overthrow Edward II. Their relationship quickly deepened beyond political alliance. Isabella and Mortimer became lovers. This was a monumental act of adultery, especially for a queen, as it not only violated sacred marital vows, but also carried the implicit threat of questioning the legitimacy of the royal heir. But Isabella, feeling utterly abandoned and betrayed by her husband, embraced this dangerous liaison. She was no longer just the king's estranged wife. She became a determined and ruthless force, earning the chilling nickname Shewolf of France from later chroniclers. With Mortimer as her confidant and co-conspirator, Isabella began to gather support from discontented English nobles and exiles in France. They'd planned an invasion of England, not just to remove the Despensers, but to depose Edward II himself. To gain legitimacy, Isabella arranged for her young son, Prince Edward, the future Edward III, to be betrothed to Philippa of Hainault, securing military and financial aid from Hainault and other continental allies. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer, accompanied by a small but determined force of English exiles and foreign mercenaries, landed on the English coast. Their arrival was met with widespread support. The Despensers' tyrannical rule had made them so unpopular that the English nobility and common people flocked to Isabella's banner. Edward II found himself isolated, and without allies, the invasion was swift and decisive. The Despensers were quickly captured and subjected to brutal public executions, a gruesome testament to the people's hatred. Edward II attempted to flee, but was apprehended. In a dramatic and unprecedented move, a parliament was convened in January 1327 that declared Edward II unfit to rule. He was formally deposed, and his son, Prince Edward, was proclaimed king as Edward III. For the next 4 years, Isabella and Mortimer effectively ruled England as regents for the young King Edward III. Their power was absolute, their lavish lifestyle undeniable. They punished their enemies and rewarded their allies, establishing a new order, but their very success and their blatant personal relationship bred resentment. Mortimer, in particular, grew arrogant, accumulating vast wealth and titles, behaving more like a king than a regent. His pride alienated even those who had supported the invasion. The young King Edward III, though still a teenager, began to chafe under his mother's and Mortimer's control. He was increasingly uncomfortable with their dominance and the lingering scandal surrounding their affair. In a bold move, on October 19, 1330, Edward III, aided by loyal nobles, launched a surprise attack on Nottingham Castle, where Isabella and Mortimer were staying. They found Mortimer with Isabella confirming the nature of their relationship. Mortimer was seized, tried for treason, and swiftly condemned. On November 29, 1330, he was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. The same gruesome fate he had orchestrated for the Despensers, Isabella's lover, had met a brutal end. Isabella was spared execution due to her status as queen, and the king's mother, however, her power was stripped away. She was placed under house arrest, ostensibly for her own protection, but effectively exiled from court life. She spent the remaining 27 years of her life in comfortable but supervised retirement, her son Edward III visiting her occasionally. The story of Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer remains one of the most sensational and politically explosive tales of adultery and intrigue in medieval history. It demonstrated how personal passions, when intertwined with royal power and widespread discontent, could fundamentally alter the course of a kingdom.